Through 1968 was the launching ground for such talents as Pat Paulson, Glenn Campbell, and Steve Martin, and is still considered one of the most innovative comedy programs.
The Smothers Brothers had one of the biggest variety shows on American television. Then in April 1969, CBS can let it without warning. The official reason sounded simple enough. The real reason was something else entirely. There were whispers about a band sermon, a song cut mid-performance, and a 5-minute segment replaced with a political ad nobody saw coming. Our relationship, I think at that point things were coming down us pretty hard, and we started to take care of each other a lot more. We did 72 of those shows. What actually happened in those final weeks before the network pulled the plug? And why do fans still pause these 13 moments decades later trying to understand what they just witnessed? The truth runs deeper than the show ever got to tell. 13. The Morons Cold Open. And now here's Tommy. In one of the opening monologues from Season 2, Tom Smothers leaned toward the camera and said he had finally figured out how to tell people apart. Poor people, he explained, were less ons. Rich people were more ons. The audience laughed, soft at first, still settling into the joke. Then Dick Smothers stepped in, calm and curious, and asked the question that changed the whole bit. Who exactly was running the country? Tom did not hesitate. He looked straight into the camera, smiled, and gave his answer in a single word. The morons. That was all it took. One fast line dropped in the first half-minute of a Sunday night variety show on the biggest network in America, and it landed at a time when President Lyndon Baines Johnson and his administration were directing the Vietnam War. CBS executives were stunned. Later accounts, including comments from Bill Tankersley, who led CBS Standards and Practices during the show's run, make it clear why the line slipped through. It came too quickly. It carried no obvious warning sign. By the time anyone fully registered it, it had already aired. So, the joke stayed in the broadcast. After that, CBS made sure nothing like it stayed in future scripts. People who caught it that night kept talking about it for years. It was the kind of joke that moved so fast you almost doubted you heard it right. Then you went back, looked closer, and realized you absolutely did. 12. Mason Williams premieres Classical Gas. Live in 1967, the Smothers Brothers hired a 28-year-old head writer named Mason Williams. He was already a gifted writer, but that was only part of the story. Williams was also a classical guitarist, and he had written an instrumental piece for solo guitar with orchestra that no record label seemed eager to release. The brothers saw something in it, so in early 1968, they gave him a place on the show to perform it himself on national television. The piece was called Classical Gas. The performance lasted 3 minutes and 4 seconds. Williams stood alone on stage with a 6-string acoustic guitar and played a melody shaped by Spanish influence over a recorded orchestral track. There was no comedy to soften it, no sketch wrapped around it, no extra trick to guide the audience in. It was simply one of the show's writers under the lights playing his own music for the country. And then everything changed. Within weeks, Classical Gas became one of the biggest instrumental hits of the late 1960s. It climbed to number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100. It won 3 Grammy Awards. By 1969, some industry estimates credited it with more than 6 million radio plays, enough to make it the most played instrumental in the history of American AM radio at the time. Williams later said he nearly lost credit for what he had made because Warner Brothers did not fully understand the song's potential at first. That television moment mattered. The Smothers Brothers did more than air a performance. They gave the piece a door into American homes, and Williams walked through it. When you stop on that 1968 broadcast, you are looking at the exact instant a comedy writer became a recording artist in full view of the nation. 11. Glenn Campbell before he was Glenn Campbell. During the 1968 to 1969 season, the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour featured a rising country guitarist named Glenn Campbell in a series of musical appearances. It's knowing that your door is always open and your path is free to walk. That makes me leave my sleeping bag rolled up and stashed behind your couch. At the time, most
viewers did not know his name. Campbell had spent years in Los Angeles as a session musician playing guitar without public credit on records by the Beach Boys, Frank Sinatra, Elvis Presley, and Dean Martin. He was part of the studio circle that would later be known as the Wrecking Crew. Inside the business, he was respected. Outside it, he was still largely unseen. The show changed that. On the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, Campbell was given solo spots that let viewers hear him clearly and see him fully. That exposure kept building. By the time CBS led the Smothers Brothers in April 1969, Campbell had gained enough national attention from those appearances to move into his own CBS variety series, The Glen Campbell Good Time Hour. It premiered that same year as the summer replacement for the Smothers Brothers' canceled slot and remained on the air for 3 seasons. 10. The Who Detonate the Set, September 17, 1967. This remains one of the most famous live television musical performances of the 1960s. It is also one of the most replayed, rewatched, and studied moments the show ever produced. The date was September 17, 1967. It was the second episode of the second season. The lineup that night included Beat Davis in a comic sketch as Queen Elizabeth the Fern, Mickey Rooney, and a British rock band that CBS staff viewed with caution because their reputation was already rough, loud, and hard to predict. That band was The Who. The taping took place at CBS Television City in Los Angeles. The Who were scheduled to close the show with My Generation. By then, the band already had a routine for the song's ending. Pete Townend would smash his guitar into the amplifier. Keith Moon would tear apart his drum kit. To heighten the final moment, Moon sometimes placed a small amount of low-grade gunpowder inside one of his bass drums and set it off at the climax. For this taping, he wanted more. The rehearsal had felt weak to him and he wanted the real performance to leave a mark. It certainly did. Later accounts from producer Alan Bly and documentary director Jeff Stein describe a chain of separate decisions that turned the effect into something much bigger. A stagehand acting under instructions from Bly to strengthen the blast added more explosive. Moon working on his own persuaded another stagehand with alcohol to add even more. Then Moon himself added still more powder. No one seems to have realized how much had already gone in. By the time the performance reached its end, Stein later estimated that Moon's bass drum held around 10 times the legal amount of gunpowder allowed on a Hollywood soundstage. When the explosion hit, the studio shook. Cameras shuddered. Cymbal fragments cut Keith Moon's arm. Roger Daltrey was thrown across the stage. Pete Townshend's hair caught fire and his right ear fully recovered. For years afterward, Townshend said publicly that this moment on the Smothers Brothers set was the single greatest cause of the hearing damage that stayed with him for the rest of his life. By the 1980s, that damage had grown so serious that touring safely required protective stage monitors. Then, in the smoke and confusion, came one more unforgettable image. Still dazed from the blast, Town walked over to Tommy Smothers, took Tommy's acoustic guitar right out of his hands, and smashed it on the floor. 9. The real origin of Mom Always Liked You Best. Anyone who has watched the show closely has probably noticed one line returning again and again. Tom and Dick Smothers would move through a sketch, spar with each other, push the joke until Tom finally reached the end of his patience, then turn to Dick, and snap that Mom always liked him best. That's 'cause my mom liked my brother best and she never liked me. Mom gave my this is not true. Mom liked you best. She alright, Mom. Alright, just be quiet 1 minute. Mom liked you best. You lower your voice. Mom liked you best. The audience came to expect it. By 1968, many people in the studio were already saying the line before Tom got there. But the joke had a real history behind it. And that history ran much deeper than most viewers knew. The line came out of the brothers' own childhood in California. Their mother, Ruth Ramick Smothers, raised 3 children on her own after her husband, Major Thomas Boland Smothers Jr. died in April 1945 as a Japanese prisoner of war. His story alone carried enormous weight. He had graduated from West Point in the class of 1929. He survived the Battle of Bataan. He survived the Baton Death March. He endured nearly 3 years in the Cabinet prison camp. He lived through the sinking of the prison ship Ori Maru off Sabubi Bay in December 1944 and the bombing of the Honora Maru into Cow Harbor in January 1945. He died on another transport ship while B.N. G moved toward Korea. He was 36 years old. Tom was 8 when his father died. Dick was 5. That loss stayed with the family, and so did the private humor that helped them live with it. Over the years, in family conversations and later interviews, including a 2014 NPR interview Tom gave to Terry Gross, the brothers described how they had teased their mother for years by pretending she favored one son over the other. The line first entered their comedy in the late 1950s during their nightclub act at the Purple Onion in San Francisco. By the time the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour arrived in 1967, it was already one of the strongest pieces in their stage material. On television, it became even bigger. 8. Share a Little Tea with Goldie. In the second and third seasons of the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, viewers met a recurring character named Goldie O'Keefe, played by comedian Lee French. On the surface, Goldie seemed harmless and cheerful. She looked like the host of a daytime homemaking segment. She wore bright sweaters, offered domestic advice, and spoke in a warm, gentle voice about the little problems of everyday life. That surface was the whole trick. Underneath the sweet presentation, Goldie's segments were built as a coded celebration of marijuana culture. The disguise was clever, and the writers enjoyed every second of it. In fact, the character's original name in the writer's room had been Mary Jane Roach. At the time, Mary Jane was slang for marijuana, and Roach referred to the end of a smoked joint. Producer Alan Bly later explained that the writers knew CBS would never allow those two words together on screen, so they changed the name. Even then, the replacement kept the joke alive. Goldie referred to a strong strain of cannabis, and O'Keefe played on the sound of ku, another slang term linked to hashish. The references never really disappeared. They just slipped into better hiding. The segment itself was called Share a Little Tea with Goldie. In late 1960s slang, that phrase carried its own meaning. Goldie would invite viewers into conversations about herbs, roaches, brownies, and little bits of advice that sounded innocent enough to anyone outside the culture. To everyone inside it, the joke was obvious. One especially memorable episode taped on February 2 in 1968 featured Don Knotts as Goldie's guest. Knotts, beloved for playing Deputy Barney Fay on The Andy Griffith Show, sat there with perfect seriousness while the two of them moved through a long conversation full of coded marijuana references. 7. Pat Polson runs for president. Thank you. In a few days, the voters will go to the polls and elect a man to ruin the country. I mean, run the country. In the spring of 1968, the writing team behind the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour launched one of the boldest comic ideas in television history. They decided to run their own deadpan editorial commentator, Pat Polson, for President of the United States. Polson, whose full name was Patrick Leighton Polson, had been born on July 6, 1927 in South Bend, Washington. His path onto the show had started quietly. Tom Smothers had first noticed him years earlier at the Purple Onion in San Francisco, and bought 2 of his songs for $40. Polson later joined the show behind the scenes, writing material and handling errands. Then he moved in front of the camera as an editorialist. By 1968, he had become something far more unusual. He was a television comic running a fake campaign that slowly stopped feeling fake. He entered the race under the STAG ticket, short for Straight Talking American Government. The campaign included filmed segments in real towns, real speeches, real stops, and real spending. Polson treated the role with such complete seriousness that the joke deepened each time he spoke. His slogan became famous. If nominated, he would not run. If elected, he would not serve. Another line followed close behind. They had upped their standards. Now up yours. When critics pressed him, he brushed them aside with picky, picky, picky. When reporters asked about serious issues, he drifted into a cloud of formal-sounding language that seemed purposeful until you noticed it never actually said anything. That was the genius of it. The campaign began as satire, yet it touched something real enough that people responded to it beyond the joke. According to Democratic Party material that surfaced years later, Hubert Humphrey's campaign staff grew uneasy during the summer of 1968 because Polson's popularity in certain groups looked strong enough to raise fears about write-in votes. No one can say with certainty how many people actually wrote in Pat Polson that November, though some estimates place the total in the tens of thousands. 6. Joan Baez dedicates a song to her imprisoned husband. In March 1969, Joan Baez taped a guest appearance on the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. Before she began to sing, she offered a short dedication on camera. She said the song was for her husband, David Harris, who was about to enter federal prison. That statement alone was serious. What made it sharper was the reason behind it. Harris had helped found the Resistance, a movement that urged American men of draft age to refuse induction during the Vietnam War. He had been convicted for refusing the draft, and he was preparing to begin his prison sentence. Baez wanted viewers to understand exactly why he was going to jail. She wanted the moral meaning of the moment to stay attached to his name. CBS removed that meaning. The censors left in the part where Baez said her husband was going to prison. They cut the explanation that told viewers he had refused military service because he believed the war was wrong. When the episode aired, the audience heard only the prison reference, stripped of the principle behind it. Without the missing context, the dedication changed shape. A man going to prison could be anything in the minds of viewers. A thief, a fraud, a violent criminal. By taking out the reason, the network reshaped the image completely. The original taping survived in another form. It later turned up in documentary recovery work and aired on Canadian CTV in March 1969. In that version, Baez says plainly that Harris is going to prison because he refused to take part in a war he believed was immoral. American viewers did not get that version in 1969. What they received was the edited silence left behind after the truth had been cut away. 5. Pete Seeger's first cut, Big Muddy. September 10, 1967. Pete Seeger had been shut out of American network television since the early 1950s. By 1967, he was already one of the most admired folk musicians in the world. He had written or helped make famous songs like We Shall Overcome, Where Have All the Flowers Gone, and If I Had a Hammer. Yet for 15 years, CBS, NBC, and ABC had kept him off their broadcasts. That all traced back to 1955 when the House UN-American Activities Committee labeled him a communist sympathizer. Seeger refused to give them names. He was convicted of contempt of Congress. After that, the networks quietly kept the door closed. Tom Smothers wanted that door opened. Years later, Tom told a story that captured how strange television power could be. One morning around 3 a.m., Bill Paley, the CEO of CBS and a close friend of President Lyndon Johnson, called him after the Smothers Brothers had aired a sketch making fun of Johnson on a Sunday night show. Paley told Tom to ease up on the president. Tom saw his chance and asked what he would get in return. For months, the Smothers team had been trying to book Pete Seeger. Haley agreed. Just like that, the blacklist cracked in the middle of the night. Seeger taped his return to network television on September 10, 1967 for the second season premiere of the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. He performed a medley of anti-war songs. And the last song in that set was an original called Waist Deep in the Big Muddy. The song told the story of a U.S. Army captain in World War II who ordered his men into a flooded river and drowned there. The message was easy to catch. It pointed straight at Lyndon Johnson's growing war in Vietnam. The chorus ended with the words, "The big fool said to push on." CBS cut the song before the episode aired. Seeger still appeared on television. The medley still aired. Yet the last song was gone. If you watch the version CBS broadcast on September 10, Seeger starts strumming Big Muddy and then the program suddenly jumps at the 257 mark. Right after that, his acoustic guitar is somehow a banjo. The break is so rough that the edit almost feels louder than the song itself. You can stop the footage and see exactly where the network stepped in. For Pete Seeger's second Big Muddy, February 25, 1968, Tom Smothers did not let the censorship stay hidden. He leaked the story to the New York Times, and once the paper ran it, the public reaction came fast. CBS was embarrassed and the network agreed to bring Pete Seeger back. 5 months later, on February 25, 1968, Seeger returned. This time the audience was even bigger. The broadcast reached 13.5 million households, which meant more people saw this performance than would have seen the first one if it had been allowed to air in full back in September. Seeger walked onto the stage and performed another medley of anti-war songs, moving through American history from the Civil War onward. Then he arrived at waist deep in the Big Muddy. This time the song stayed. He sang every line. He reached the final chorus. The big fool said to push on and then lifted his guitar to his face at the end. People watching then saw it as a small gesture with a lot inside it. Part shrug, part victory salute, part quiet sign that he had just broken through a wall that had held for 15 years. What happened next gives the moment even more weight. 2 days later, on February 27, 1968, Walter Cronkite returned from Vietnam and delivered a primetime editorial on the CBS Evening News calling for the United States to leave the war. White House staff members later said Lyndon Johnson took that hard. According to several later accounts, he told aides that if he had lost Cronkite, he had lost Middle America. Then on March 31, 1968, less than 5 weeks after Seeger sang Big Muddy on CBS, Johnson announced that he would not run for re-election. So if you pause that Pete Seeger performance, you are seeing much more than a folk song. You are seeing one of those small turning points that only look small until history catches up to it. In that moment, culture, television, and politics all met on one stage. 3. Harry Belafonte's band Chicago Convention segment. By September 1968, the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour had entered its 3rd season, and the pressure around the show had only grown. For the season premiere, the singer Harry Belafonte taped a musical performance of Lord Don't Stop the Carnival. The setup for the segment was carefully built. As Belafonte sang, the show used chroma key effects to place news footage behind him from the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, where police had beaten protesters in the streets outside the Conrad Hilton Hotel earlier that summer. Millions of Americans had already seen those scenes during convention coverage. Now the show placed those violent images behind a lively calypso performance. And the contrast carried the meaning with perfect clarity. CBS removed the whole segment. There was no partial cut. There was no shorter version. The network took out the entire 5 minutes. And this is where the story turns from political censorship into something even stranger. Once CBS pulled the segment, the season premiere ended up 5 minutes short. The network still needed to fill that time, so it sold those 5 minutes to the Republican National Committee. In the broadcast that went out to viewers, the space where Harry Belafonte was supposed to sing over footage of police violence at the Democratic National Convention became a paid campaign advertisement for Richard Nixon. That detail changes the whole feel of the story. This was not just a performance that vanished. It was a performance replaced with something that pushed in the opposite political direction. If you watch the September 1968 premiere and stop on Nixon's face during that inserted ad, the date suddenly matters even more. The missing piece becomes visible by its absence, and the switch tells its own story. Point 2, the final unaired episode, April 13, 1969. By late March 1969, the fight between the Smothers Brothers and CBS had reached a breaking point. The brothers learned that the network would refuse to air their April 13 episode unless major changes were made. Tommy Smothers answered that threat with even more defiance. He brought in Dan Rowan, host of NBC's Rowan and Martin's Logan, to stand in for Dick Smothers during the opening monologue, turning the very start of the show into a joke about its possible end. He invited David Steinberg back for another sermon. He booked Nancy Wilson and used their duet to comment on the network's recent discomfort with on-air interracial romance. He also brought in Teddy Neely, the Broadway star of Hair, a musical that had already made CBS executives uneasy for 2 years. Then the episode moved toward its sharpest target. The brothers focused on Senator John Pastore of Rhode Island, the Democratic chair of the Senate Commerce Committee. That committee oversaw the Federal Communications Commission, which meant Pastore had real influence over television. Over the previous year, he had spoken publicly about making television more wholesome and more family-friendly. The brothers answered that by giving him the Flying Fickle Finger of Fate award, a running joke linked to Laugh-In with Dan Rowan joining in. Then the episode closed on a very different note with Tommy Smothers offering a solemn tribute to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who had been assassinated almost exactly 1 year earlier on April 4, 1968. American viewers never saw that episode. On April 4, 1969, exactly 1 year after King's assassination, CBS President William S. Paley canceled the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. The official explanation was that the brothers had repeatedly failed to deliver tapes within the 10-day pre-screening period required by contract. The April 13th slot did not go to their new episode. It went to a rerun. Meanwhile, the unaired episode was sent to Canada, where CTV broadcast it without the censorship problems it faced in the United States. American television did not show it until 1993 when he obtained the rights in air. The original tapes with added interviews. What makes this even sharper is that later viewers and critics judged the episode to be one of the funniest the show ever made. That same episode also became the one that ended the show. If you pause during the pastor segment, you are watching a series take aim at the forces surrounding it while those same forces are already moving in. 1. The awkward one. David Steinberg's Jonah sermon. This is the moment that sits at the center of the whole story. Television historian David Biannucci, who wrote the major book on the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, argued that this was the single piece of content that pushed CBS to the point where firing the show became unavoidable. David Steinberg was 26 years old, a Canadian Jewish comedian born on August 9, 1942 in Winnipeg. He was the son of an Orthodox rabbi. By 1968, he had become a regular stand-up performer at Second City in Chicago, and Tom Smothers noticed him there and brought him onto the show. On October 27, 1968, Steinberg made his first appearance on the program with a comic monologue shaped like a religious sermon. That first sermon focused on Moses and the burning bush. It drew its humor from the way some traditions read scripture in a rigid and literal way. CBS reacted hard. According to Bianculli, who later interviewed Bill Tankersley, the head of standards and practices during the show's full run, the flood of angry letters from religious viewers set a new record for negative mail at the network. CBS then sent Tom Smothers a formal memo. Steinberg could still return to the show in the future, but one rule was now written down clearly. He was not allowed to perform another sermon on the program. That should have ended it. Yet, by March 1969, the battle between the show and CBS was already so tense that Tommy Smothers asked Steinberg to do another sermon. Anyway, Steinberg agreed without hesitation. Tom and the writers placed it into the coming episode. The show taped it. Steinberg stepped in front of the cameras. This time, the sermon was about Jonah. With his calm, dry delivery, Steinberg walked the audience through the Old Testament story. Jonah, he explained, had been swallowed by a great fish. That fish had been thrown into a ship led by 23 Gentile sailors who, as their wont from time to time, threw the Jew overboard. Then he moved into the line that became one of the most famous unaired jokes in American television history. Old Testament scholars, he said, believe Jonah had been swallowed by a whale. Gentile New Testament scholars replied that Jews had it wrong. And then came the punchline about Gentiles literally grabbing Jews by the Old Testament. The joke landed in a very narrow and dangerous place. It was theological. It was ethnic. It played on the long Christian use of Hebrew scripture. It also worked as a sexual pun in English. All of that sat inside one brief comic image. that complexity is part of what made it so explosive. It was smart, sharp, and difficult to contain. A censor in 1969 had no easy way to trim its meaning because the whole point of the line lived in everything happening at once. The audience in the studio needed a second to catch up. In the surviving footage, you can feel that delay. The laughter comes in slightly late as people work through what he just said and then realize where the joke has taken them. CBS never aired the episode. It had been taped in late March 1969. The planned April 13th broadcast was canceled. Then on April 4th, William S. Paley canceled the entire show. That summer, CBS replaced the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour with Heh Hall. The Jonah sermon eventually reached viewers in Canada through CTV. In the United States, it surfaced in 1993 when he ran the lost episodes and later appeared again in the 2002 Bravo documentary Smothered. Over the years, the line has kept showing up in oral histories and interviews. Steinberg himself said in a 2010 conversation with NPR's Terry Gross that the Jonah sermon was the bit that effectively ended the Smothers Brothers' run on CBS. The show had already taken heavy blows. Belfont had been removed. Seeger had been cut. Bays had been edited. Pastore had been mocked. By then the wall was already cracked. Steinberg's sermon drove the final break through it. He went on to a huge career after that. Steinberg guest hosted The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson 12 times, a number reached by very few people outside of Bob Hope. He later directed episodes of Seinfeld, Curb Your Enthusiasm, Friends, and Mad About You. Even so, the Jonah sermon remained a defining early clip of his career. It still stands as the most watched and most paused piece of comedy from those years. Watching it now feels tense, smart, and strangely intimate. It still carries the shock of a joke that knew exactly where the line was, stepped onto it, and stayed there long enough to change television history.